I've been through things as an HR professional, but some of the things that I've heard other HR professionals are going through around the world is really terrifying and disturbing for me. Think about corporate scandals, and behind there, an HR professional who had a mental breakdown because of the entire situation. The things you can't say, the things that you hold on to when you know where the bodies are and the conversations that have happened that led to the bodies being where they are. Anyone can look on my LinkedIn profile and see HR professionals talk about having people come to their homes and threaten their families because they've lost their jobs. These are the things that we suffer and that we endure and that we go through.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. On Work for Humans, we often debate the effectiveness of HR resources as a function, but it's easy to slip into sounding critical of HR people. In today's episode, we're going to take some time to understand the unique challenges that HR professionals face as whole human beings dealing with some of the most complex human situations. HR practitioners are the unrecognized first responders, and they suffer many of the same emotional risks as, for instance, medical professionals. Julie Turney, an HR specialist with over 15 years of experience, has personally navigated these issues. She became so focused on helping others that she didn't take care of herself. And when one of the employees she was supporting suffered a tragedy, Julie crashed. She needed help. When she looked for support for HR professionals like herself, she couldn't find anything. Drawing from her own experiences and research, Julie now dedicates herself to supporting HR professionals facing burnout, compassion fatigue, and trauma. Julie is a human resources professional, TEDx speaker, author, and founder and CEO of HRatHeart Consulting, where she supports HR people struggling with burnout, compassion fatigue, workplace trauma, and career frustration. She also practices HR as a consultant. In this episode, Julie and I talk about the key struggles of HR professionals, HR as first responders in the workplace, and the importance of self-care and support for HR. We also discuss the dynamics between human resources, employees, leadership, managers, and regulators, and other topics. Okay, as always, if you find value in Work for Humans, don't forget to subscribe to show your support. And now I bring you my conversation with Julie Turney. Julie Turney, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you for having me, Dart. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you have ended up in the role of real HR for HR, in a role in which you help HR practitioners with the challenges of their work. And on this show, I often critique HR. And I try not to do it in an unkind way because I'm not actually trying to critique HR people. And I recognize the challenges of being HR people. I am HR people, but I'm not the kind of HR people that you have been, which is when companies get big enough, for listeners, there's a part of HR that works on math and systems and statistics, and that's what I am. I'm not frontline HR, and frontline HR is very different. But we're never going to understand what's going on unless we recognize the practitioners of HR as whole humans in a challenging situation and not simplify the nature of the job. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. How did you go from being an HR practitioner to what you do today?
It was quite an easy transition. About 8 years ago, I went on this journey of Googling HR for HR. And that happened because I'd gone through something and I felt like there's so many times in my HR career where I've asked, where is the HR? And found nothing. And I was Googling for weeks, looking for something, anything. And all I could find was what HR can do for the business, what HR can do for the employees, but nothing about the reverse. What happens? What can leaders do for HR to support HR? what can employees do to support HR? Where is the HR for HR? I've always been taught that when you see a need, you fill a need. And that started me on this journey of exploring supporting HR professionals who are struggling with their HR careers. And I did a beta test, and about 6 of my friends were happy to support me in that test. And it turns out that it definitely is a need. And so I started on this journey of exploring and sharing stories and experiences on LinkedIn about the challenges that we face as HR professionals. And that really was the starting point, because then so many people, HR professionals on LinkedIn, started reaching out to me and saying, this is exactly what I've gone through. I feel seen. I feel heard. I need help. I need help. I need help. And that's what I've experienced for the last 8 years, just talking to HR professionals, supporting them, coaching them, guiding them for the last 8 years. And it's been an honor. I was still in corporate HR when I started my practice, but then I slowly, during the pandemic, I came to some realizations about corporate HR that I didn't like it and I didn't want to do it for the rest of my life. And I started my transition into my corporate HR practice, which is what I do now.
What were the kinds of challenges that you faced that led you to do that Google search for HR for HR?
The one that made me actually do the search was I had gone through this exercise with my organization to recruit for some very important positions. They were not easy positions to recruit for. And within the first 6 months of filling all of those positions, my CEO turned around and said, we need to do layoffs. And obviously, then the layoffs happened to the people who had spent months trying to recruit. And it was very devastating for me. And as a matter of fact, at the end of the exercise, I heard that employees were calling me Thanos. And there's so many different things that have happened to me. Like, I went through a suicide situation where I had an employee that committed suicide, and I had another employee that went through a mental breakdown in the job. And they were all situations that just made me think, where is the HR for HR? I need to talk to someone about how I'm feeling about the frustrations that I'm getting from dealing with all of these different situations, and also the pain of dealing with these situations. And that's some of the things that I've gone through. I've been through a lot, but those are the 3 things that are top of mind for me.
One of the reframes that you've proposed that I find very valuable is that HR is the forgotten first responders,
Mm-hmm.
and that HR is on a front line and is responding to crucial human situations, but is not seen that way.
Absolutely. I have spent a lot of time just looking at the experiences that I've had in my corporate HR career, and along with other HR professionals who share stories on LinkedIn with me, to recognize that we are the first responders. And I think it really hit me during the pandemic. We were thinking about the first responders who were taking care of people who had COVID, but there were also other first responders, which were the HR teams, who were either trying to make sure that employees got home safely and that they were able to work from home effectively and that they had all the equipment and tools that they needed. But there were lots of conversations that were happening with leadership that employees would never know about, around, should we be tracking how many times people click their mouse, if they're really working, if they're really doing what we're asking them to do. And there was a lot of frustration around that. So all of these things have really put us in a space of just recognizing that when there's a crisis in the organization, whether it's something that affects our brand as an organization and leads to corporate dread, how people think about the organization, usually there's somewhere around there an HR professional that's given advice that's been ignored, but has to now meet the needs of the people and give them some kind of a response. And so that's where, for me, I see HR as the first responders of the organization.
And there's 2 dynamics that I hear there. So first of all, for years I was a criminal defense investigator, and in a way it's the closest thing I've come to some of the challenges that frontline HR faces, which is that I had to be exposed to things that happened that I really didn't want to know about.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, people don't come to HR with the easy stuff. They come to HR with the hard stuff. And I was forced to scrutinize it because it was my job to understand it. Things that you would normally turn away from, either because you're polite or because it's painful, you can't. And so you are constantly exposed to some of the hardest things that are going on. You often talk about holding space for those hard things. I don't know what exactly that means when you say to hold space.
It's about actually being intentional about taking the time to support people who are really struggling. So it's not just a fly-by conversation, but it's about hearing the deep, scary, dark things that are really impacting how an HR professional does their job. It's beyond the what keeps them up at night. It's the what won't let me sleep at all. And that's completely different. So when I think about holding space for HR professionals, I take my calendar is open 365 days of the year for any HR professional to schedule a call with me for 30 minutes and talk about some of the things that they're dealing with that are difficult for them. And I've heard some things. I've been through things as an HR professional, but some of the things that I've heard other HR professionals are going through around the world is really terrifying and disturbing for me that they have to go through these things.
Can you describe any of them very generically without betraying any confidences, but the nature of the challenges that are faced?
When we're dealing with complex situations, whether it's retrenchments, and sometimes when we're going through those processes, we may have to let go some of our team members. And that's a very difficult situation to go through and know that you have to go home as well. But then think about corporate scandals. And there are so many corporate scandals that have happened over the years. And behind there, an HR professional who has had a mental breakdown because of the entire situation. The underhandedness, I want to say, the things you can't say, the things that you hold on to when you know where the bodies are, so to speak, and the conversations that have happened that led to the bodies being where they are, the lack of respect for employees and having to hear how managers really think and feel about their team members, and the things that happen as a result of a promotion that the manager may not have wanted to give, but then there's conversations happening behind that. So a lot of fly on the wall stuff. But then incident wise, the repercussions and the effects of that. And this is the thing that I really want people to pay attention to. Because when all of these things happen that cause people to lose their jobs, a lot of times people don't see the manager or they don't see the CEO or they don't see the other executives that sat in that room and made the decision. But people make a clear distinction to see HR and threaten us, threaten families. So sometimes I have calls or anyone can look on my LinkedIn profile and see my content and see HR professionals talk about having people come to their homes and threaten their families because they've lost their jobs. A decision that is not made by HR, but we are the only people that you see when those things are happening. It's got to be HR. HR had to have made that decision. No. And so these are the things that really cause great cause for concern for me and many other HR professionals in terms of the things that we suffer and that we endure and that we go through.
What strikes me about that, it's so striking about that, is how alone you are in those situations. You may not agree with the decisions that were made, yet you need to execute the decisions anyway, and you do your very best to do it in a way that is.
Humane, with dignity and respect.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right. So here you are, you're the messenger of something that you may not agree with. You can't say you don't agree with it because that would make it worse. And there must be also a moral injury of feeling complicit
Absolutely.
in
Absolutely.
either not diverting the decision or in then having to execute that decision.
It's so hard. It's such a lonely place.
And in many of the companies that the HR professionals that you talk to, they're the only HR person in the company, right? It's not a giant company.
No. And that's the other piece. Because sometimes you're sitting in those organizations as an HR department of one. And again, that's crazy, right? You're a numbers guy. You know, when you talk about ratios of employees to management, think about employees to HR. You have 400 employees in an organization and one HR. I've had HR clients who are 700 to one. Nowhere is that a fair fight in any way.
All
I mean, we're
right.
not coming to fight, but nowhere is it fair. It's not equitable that you expect me to support you with 700 people and it's just me. That's a lot of work.
Yeah, the companies I've worked for have had large groups of HR professionals who could at least turn to each other. But there's a burden of confidentiality. In other words, there's nobody you can turn to talk about this. It's your job to not speak about it.
Hmm. It really is. And that causes so much mental frustration and fatigue because there's so much moving parts to a business. And you have the building of the business, the development of employee journeys, disciplinary issues, and terminations. But all of those things are not happening in isolation of each other. Sometimes they're happening all at once. It's a very taxing, mind numbing experience to go through.
I have to say, too, that the few times that I've actually interacted with HR in which HR was supporting me, in two instances, I was not at my best. I'm not proud of the emotional states that I was in. So it's also true that your perspective of managers must be a very large data set of managers at their worst.
We see people definitely at their best and a lot of times at their worst.
Did your education teach you what you needed emotionally to do the job? Because I have HR textbooks because I'm really interested in what the standard HR. Also, by the way, you can buy them for $3. They're very cheap if they're like 2 years old. And what's taught in there? And what's taught in there is how to execute performance management. It's how to execute compensation. It's very operational. I didn't see anything in there about developing muscles for the emotional labor that you have to do. And I didn't see anything on tools for self care. So, were you equipped for this when you came into it?
Definitely not. Absolutely not. I talk about it quite often about the things that your degree or your certification doesn't prepare you for. I always say that HR is a calling, to be honest. I feel that true HR professionals, whether at their best or trying to do wonderful work in organizations, I believe it is a calling. It is not for everyone. And I say that because I see both sides of the spectrum now, sitting in the position that I'm in now, where I hear employees talk about terrible experiences they've had with HR. And a lot of times it's because those HR professionals are either very transactional or they're not prepared for the emotional stuff that comes with the job. And so they handle it in a transactional way, which makes it seem robotic, which gives people not a nice feeling, not a good feeling of HR. And emotional intelligence is very big in this space, especially if you are front facing HR, dealing with people every single day and giving advice, giving counsel, giving guidance, sharing strategy. There is a measure of emotion that comes with these things because we're human. And so emotion is involved. And it takes someone with a lot of emotional intelligence to be able to navigate that in such a way that we create the best outcomes for the people we serve. Everyone can't do that.
What would it look like if you were putting together a curriculum for HR professionals that started to help with build some of those tools? What would that look like?
Ooh, that's a good one. I actually do have a program that I run right now. It's built on things that were not taught. So I do tackle things like building business acumen, because I think a lot of us don't know how to do that. And I do talk about being resilient, being agile as an HR professional. But the emotional intelligence piece of it is very high in my conversations and how I teach that course, how to handle situations that pop up for most of us in HR. So you have a domestic violence issue, someone going through divorce, someone who is feeling suicidal. You have an employee who has multiple personalities. You're now finding it out for the first time. There are lots of different scenarios, and they're based on not just what I've gone through, but what other HR professionals have shared with me and have allowed me to put into this course. And so that's what it would look like for me. Lots of the things we don't know or the things we're not taught. And also, I do think the other piece for me is being able to tell stories with data, because your absenteeism rates, your attrition rates, a lot of those things are tied to things that people are experiencing in their organization as it relates to relationships that they may be having with others, leaders, other employees. And so when I think about those figures, I think about, why are people sick so much in this particular department or that department? What's the story? And those things are important to know so that you can support employees in a meaningful and an intentional way if they need it. And it may very well be, and again, something else we do. I've heard of HR professionals who've gone to chemo with employees, who have supported employees going through adoptions, or who have lost a pet because pets are part of the family. And so there are all of these different scenarios that we go through, and it's, how do we deal with it in a way that's humane, treating people with dignity and respect? It would look like all of that for me.
Right. So some of those skills are skills that you can use to influence the organization and influence the leadership by attaching metrics to business acumen, for instance, and being able to say, look, this is costing your company money, or this is having a detrimental effect. And some of those tools are tools that are essentially a therapist's tools, which is, how do I talk to people who are going through grief or who are going through something else? It strikes me from what you're saying that one of the reasons that HR is misunderstood or devalued is because the confidentiality of the situations you are in makes them silent. And so as a result of that, the only time that I get glimpses into the challenges that frontline HR experiences is when they're talking to each other briefly and saying, oh my God, I wish I didn't know that. Sort of thing. But that's the extent of it. And I'm in HR. I don't get exposure to those. But so here's somebody who's like a firefighter, but nobody can see the fire. They're like a doctor, but nobody can see the hospital or the sickness. They're doing something that is incredibly challenging for them and for others, but that it has to be a secret. So that's why I'm glad we're talking about it.
Yeah, it's hard. And you're right. And like I said, there's so much information that we hold that we can't share, that we can't say. So when employees ask us questions, I mean, my go-to is, I can either confirm or deny. I just can't. I can't. Or it's not my place to say. We spend a lot of time in defensive mode. And so sometimes, because we're in that mode, I guess sometimes if we're not at our best on any particular day, that may not always come across as polite or pleasant as it could. But it's a lot to take on. And every situation is different. And every situation is important. Everything needs a resolution now, if you listen to leadership. And you have to find ways to compartmentalize that. And that's why I'm here, because after you've done whatever it is that needs to be done, you need to know that there's a safe space to come and say, I just went through this and it was so hard and it was so horrible. And I don't know where to go from here. I don't know how to let this go. Or I have to make this really difficult decision and I don't know how to do it in a way that doesn't leave people thinking that I don't care about them. And every day I get that call. Every day I get that email. It's hard being invisible, but doing something that's crucial to the success of the business.
I want to talk about the forces that you're caught between. I know some of them, and I want to talk about each of them. And I just added a few based upon our conversation. One of them is the leadership, the CEO, whoever's running the company. One of them is employees themselves. One of them is managers. And another one is, this is one I just added, is regulators. which is that there are people who are telling you what compliance is. And by the way, something everybody should know about compliance is invented by legislators to a large extent. So it can be extraordinarily hard to interpret and do.
Yeah.
Especially if you're a global company, you have legislatures all over the world
All over the world.
who are, remember, politicians, which I shouldn't disparage either, but I will for a second, who are creating things that are incredibly hard to implement.
Very complex.
Super complex. And so those are four forces I can think of: CEO, employee, managers, and regulators. Are there any I'm missing?
I think we should tackle those first. And then we can...
Okay, let's tackle those first. Let's talk about that.
Talk about what we're missing.
For leadership, for the CEO, what does good look like? What does not so good look like? In other words, what does a good CEO look like from the HR position? And what does a not so good CEO look like from the HR position?
So a good CEO is one that has HR reporting to them. They don't default that to someone else. That's the first thing I would say about a good CEO. They recognize the value of having HR at their side and helping to support and guide them through the people experience journey. I would also say that a good CEO is one that actually allows HR to do their job, that recognizes that whatever elective they took at university on HR is not enough to know how to HR, and that they really do recognize that you are the expert and that they allow you to do your job effectively and efficiently. I would also say that a good CEO recognizes you as a business partner. And so they don't silo you. They don't cut you out of important business decisions. They recognize that you have value in that conversation. So you're not asking for your seat at the table. They recognize that you need to be there and they have you there. It's a given. The other thing I would say about a good CEO is one that recognizes that as the business grows, HR needs to grow, whether that's with people or tools, technology, whatever we need to help manage that people experience journey. They are willing to give us the budget, equip us with the tools to get things done. So that's what good looks like. Bad is the complete opposite of all of that. All of that. That's what I would say.
What does a good CEO think of employees?
They see people over profit. They see people over process. They see people as value to the business to help them achieve their ultimate goals. Whatever strategy, mission they have in place, they recognize that people are the vehicle to get them there, but they don't use them as tools. They don't use them as cattle. They're not just numbers. They know their names. And they may not know everybody depending on the organization. I mean, I wouldn't expect a CEO with 100,000 employees to know them all, but you value that every person that is there to do a job that makes you look good, ultimately. So again, managers recognize HR as business partners. So they're there to help them build their teams professionally. And again, they too recognize the value that we bring to the team in terms of making sure that the jobs that they have or that they're creating really are fit for purpose. They recognize that the tools and the processes that we've put in place, along with their support and collaboration, and they use them. They use them effectively. I say good managers are ones that document well their employees' journey and that they're concerned about the documentation of how their people are moving through the organization. They care about the development of their team and they're intentional about making sure that any competency gaps their team members have, they will be intentional about helping them to close them. They do recognize the importance of coaching, guiding, and mentoring their team members, and that HR is there to help them with the necessary tools and resources to do that effectively so they don't fight us on it. And then again, the opposite of that is what bad managers look like. Yeah, they don't document at all, but they want to make decisions and they want us to act on them without proper documentation, which kind of touches on the compliance piece of it all. But yeah, I think good managers recognize that we are there as a support, as a partner. I must say, in my time in corporate, I would say, I don't ever want to tell a manager no. I will tell you what is not legal, what is illegal. I will tell you what parts of a policy may impact your ability to make a particular decision, but I will find a way ethically and legally to get you to a yes. But what I don't ever want is that I would say no and then they circumvent me and they do something illegal. So I always want to be able to collaborate with managers to help them achieve what they want to achieve, but in a legal and an ethical way, and a way that if it's impacting their team members, that it's done with dignity and respect, that they can see that that's what we really want for them.
So, in this constellation that you're caught between, where do employees stand? And it's a complicated question for me.
That's a loaded question.
It's a complicated question to ask because they're not like managers who you work for and they're not like CEOs who you work for. But why do you feel that it's a complicated question?
Because so many times, if you've ever looked at social media and how employees portray HR on social media, whether it's Reddit or TikTok or Instagram or Twitter, employees generally do not have a good impression of HR. And so it's easy for me to say as an HR professional that I truly do care about employees and I want them to succeed and I want them to thrive and I want them to have the best experience they could possibly have with the organization. It's another thing if the employee actually believes that and sees that and trusts it. And it's hard for many HR professionals who are new to an organization that probably just experienced bad HR. And a lot of times it comes from the bad experience of bad HR, that people now have this perception that all 12 million of us globally are terrible, when nothing could be further from the truth. But we all get lumped into this one bag of bad HR, horrible HR, because of a bad experience that an employee has had. And even though there are employees out there, even managers and CEOs or members of the C-suite who will say, I've had excellent HR. I can't say anything bad about them. I've had really great experiences, but it doesn't beat the 3 billion employees that we have globally who it looks like all of them are saying HR is terrible. And that's why I say it's a loaded question, because I know how I feel about employees and the work that I do. And I know how other HR professionals feel about employees and the work that they do. But I also know that we come against so many employees across social media who are giving this impression of HR that is absolutely horrible and inaccurate for the entire profession. It can't be accurate.
Do you feel, this is a hypothesis, that the fact that so many HR professionals are women makes HR an easier target?
That's a good question. And I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I mean, so let me think about it.
It may be an impossible question. We
I
may
don't
take
think
it
it's
out entirely.
so yes, HR is a predominantly female profession, but there are also a lot of men in the profession as well. And more men are coming into the profession because more and more men are recognizing that there are other facets of HR, like the analytics part of HR and other areas that are coming to the fore that they can be a part of. And then there are men who just really want to be a part of the front end of HR. I think that this feedback comes from men and women. And I would say I see it a lot more from women than men. And so I don't think it's because it's a female dominated profession. I don't think so. But it could be, because if I think about the dynamics of women and female relationships, it could be. And that's something to really think about. That's an interesting hypothesis to consider and maybe to build some data around. So you've given me a thought for research. But I also think that because it comes from a cross section of people, that it's just possible that each of these individuals had one bad experience that's been lumped into so many different voices. Sometimes people haven't had a bad experience with HR at all, but you'd be surprised that they just say HR sucks because they're on a chat with so many people that have said HR sucks, but they've never had a bad experience themselves. And so there are so many variables that's why I said it's a loaded question, but there's so many different variables to it. But I do believe that it's not true in its context if I think about every HR professional and every employee.
Are there environmental events? Are there things around HR professionals that cause spikes in the emotional demand for HR team members? And are each of them worth it? And so I'll give you examples. Performance management and the performance management cycle, layoffs, reorgs, a number of other things. Recently, we had Ashley Goodall on the show, and he talked about the problem with change. And what he was talking about there was just that some percentage of the change that happens in an organization is unnecessary. And yet it throws everybody into turmoil, and we could do less of it. And then he also spoke about how HR's job should be to help create the kind of culture that can withstand the necessary change. So that's what I mean when I say, is it worth it? Which is that what are the things that cause spikes in emotional demand for HR? And then do you feel like most of them are worth it? Another loaded question.
I hear what you're saying. Yes. Not so much loaded. It's a really great question that I've never really thought about before. But I would say I would talk around the retrenchments, redundancies kind of thing, especially if it's mass. So I think about all the tech companies that laid off hundreds, thousands of people over the last couple of years. Those were massive. I also think about mobility issues in organizations. So in one of my previous jobs, I worked in gas and oil, and there was a lot of mobility movement for employees to take up assignments in other countries, short-term assignments, long-term assignments. There's a lot that happens behind the scenes in those particular situations that can cause a spike, as you say. People are leaving their home countries, coming to a country they don't know anything about. It comes with its own challenges of socialization, adjustments. If a family comes and only one person, the employee, is working, and the other person has had to give up a job, a career, a life in their home country to come to a new country, there's a lot of emotional collateral in that. And I think a lot of times HR gets stuck in trying to find a way to help families make those adjustments. Is it worth it? Well, obviously, if the company thinks that that person has a skill set that this particular organization needs, and it's going to increase profits for the business, then it's worth it to the business. Is it worth it to HR? It might not be, because just so many different challenges that come with relocating an employee.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, relocation, for people who have not been involved in it, it involves tax, it involves travel, it involves facilities, it involves real estate, it involves schooling. There's a lot of things. And all of a sudden, you become the coordination point. Usually, very often, HR becomes the coordination point across a bunch of different departments. And then add on top of that the emotional layer that the family doesn't want to go, or all these different things.
And then imagine you have a spouse who, like I said, has given up a whole life. They can be very disgruntled in the assignment, which impacts the employee who is actually working in the assignment. And an unhappy partner is an unhappy employee. And therefore, that does impact HR, because we have to find a way to help that family get through that whole process. And I think that's something we don't talk about enough. And there are a lot of organizations that are global that deal with relocations. Another one that I would add is war, times of war. You think about the whole situation with Ukraine and Russia. And I had a lot of HR clients who had offices, stores in the Ukraine during that war that had to close their offices, help their employees transition through that. And again, things that I don't think we talk, because you don't think, where's HR really involved in all of that? But we are in the middle, the center, again, hidden first responders dealing with crisis, war. And I think the pandemic is an obvious one, and those challenges that come with that. But as a result, coming out of the pandemic, you have more organizations focused on remote work. And so now you have a multicultural workforce, and it's very easy for remote employees to feel that disconnection if we are not doing our part to help them connect to the organization, even though they may be thousands of miles away, hours and hours apart. There's something there fundamental that HR has to deal with emotionally for that employee to help them feel like a part of the organization. And so I would say those four things for me, along with, which I think is the obvious, more like everyday retrenchments, performance management, bullying, sexual harassment, and the list goes on and on.
Yeah, and I heard those sort of falling into categories. Some things are things that are externalities. They're just things that happen. The pandemic, we all had to deal with it, but it's not self-inflicted. Some of our responses to the pandemic may have been self-inflicted injury, but then reorgs, some of those are self-inflicted and not necessary. Some of them are. And what you mentioned too is that there's another thing that you're caught between, which is families, which wasn't on our earlier list that had CEOs, employees, managers, and regulators, is families. One of the things you're making me think is that there's certain roles inside the company that should come automatically with therapists, that there are therapists assigned, and that HR is one of those.
Oh, yes. I strongly advocate today for organizations that are recruiting HR, that have HR sitting in their organizations, that they have their contracts include therapy as a given and also coaching is a given. I say both because the work that I do, I work best when I'm collaborating with someone who also is going to therapy versus someone who is just coming for coaching, because I'm not a therapist. And so a lot of times when people come to me, especially when they're so burned out and emotionally frazzled, I can't help them until they've sought medical help, whether they've gone to a GP or they've gone for therapy and then come back to me to help them work through other things. And the other piece is because I know in my own therapy and coaching journey, I have spent time, I have a wonderful therapist now, but it took me years to find her. And I went through a process of elimination of therapists because I don't have the time to educate a therapist on what HR is or all of the intricacies of HR. I've spent time in therapy teaching my therapist what HR is and what it isn't. And I don't want to do that. And so my therapist now is a former HR professional, works perfectly for me. She's amazing. And my coach, I have two coaches, and both of them have HR backgrounds, which helps me tremendously as well with building my practice and just getting support for the vicarious trauma that I experienced as a result of working with traumatized HR professionals. And so I too have to make sure I take care of myself so that I can take care of my clients. But I do believe fundamentally that HR is one of those professions that when we talk about compensation packages, they should immediately come with therapy and coaching. Therapy is a given because at some point in time in your HR career, you may experience trauma. Some HR professionals are fortunate to go through their HR careers and never experience the kind of trauma that a lot of us have experienced. They may never get a death threat from an employee. They may never have an employee turn up at their house and threaten their family. They may never experience a death in service. They may never go through massive retrenchments, but they may experience increased workload. They may experience lack of resources and lack of tools to do their job effectively and some form of frustration. And as a result of that, they may eventually go through a cycle of burnout. So you still need to get that help and that support, even though you may never go through the dire side of the really bad side of what happens in HR. The other part around coaching and why I think it's important to have someone like me in your corner is because I understand the intricacies of HR. My specialization in HR focuses around employee engagement, employee well-being, but I know every aspect of HR. I may not be an expert at all, but I can touch it, I can see it, and I can guide you through it. I can quickly help you close some of your competency gaps.
Do you feel that managers are set up for success by the company? And I say this from a context, and the context is that I don't feel they are. And in particular, I don't feel they are in the situation where the corporate culture or the leadership culture sees the workforce as inputs to production or assets, and the manager is facing a team that they can see are people. That's where I'm coming from, is that I don't feel like they're being equipped with the tools to necessarily solve that problem. And so my question is, do you feel that I may be mistaken in that? Or do you feel like they're not set up for success?
I agree with you 100%, 1000%. I don't believe that managers are set up for success. I've worked with enough organizations, facilitated enough workshops around this topic to know that every time I ask someone in that workshop, or every time I ask a group, anyone I'm talking to, do you believe that you have the necessary tools to be successful in your role? They go, no. Do you have a coaching plan to help you navigate? Most say no. Have you ever gone through a leadership risk, leadership impact assessment to determine where your weaknesses are and how to close those through coaching? No. When you took that management position, did you really want it? Or were you voluntold? And surprisingly, most people are voluntold. Most people don't want to be managers. They don't want to lead. They don't want the responsibility. But somebody above us looked at them and said, I like that person. They work well. Make them a manager.
Right. They do the job well. Hopefully they can make more people like them, which is not actually the thing.
That's not how it works, for sure.
So I have a couple of closing questions that I ask everybody. What job do you hire your job to do for you? And so people hire you to do something for them. What do you hire your work to do for you?
This work is hard, it's heavy, it's complex, but I love it and I wouldn't do anything differently. The moment someone says to me, I feel seen, I feel heard, I'm glad to know that I'm not losing my mind, because before I talked to you, I thought I was losing my mind. When someone says, I really appreciate the time that I've worked with you and I wouldn't have had it any other way. When I hear those things, that tells me that I've done good work and that the work that I do matters and it has value. That's what success looks like to me. That's the reward every time.
And I think we've talked about this a lot, but what does your work cost you?
What does it cost me? My mental health, first of all. Like I said, the work that I do is very heavy. I take a lot of my time in my day to listen to people. I'm just listening to people and trying to understand where they're coming from. And that costs my time. It costs my energy. It costs my mental health. When I do coach and work with my clients, it's a lot of time building something different for them, helping them to unlearn and relearn and reskill. And sometimes for me, that takes a lot of mental fortitude to do that as well, to sometimes pull those things together. So I would say those things.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
They can connect with me on LinkedIn at I am Julie Turney, and on my website, which is HRatHeart.com.
So your last name is spelled Turney for people who need to know. And Julie is also Julie, so I am JulieTurney.com. Thank you very, very much for coming on the show today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.